welcome to the Heartland Connection. This is Zach Waller, the Executive Director of Hayvel, your host, coming to you guys straight from the Heartland of Israel. Hard to believe it's here already, but the summer trip is coming up next week. We've got a bunch of volunteers lined up and ready to come in. We've got some planting, going to plant more vineyards in the mountains of Samaria, and lots of things lined up, all kinds of guest speakers and education and things going to happen. And so we're really, really excited about welcoming in our summer trip volunteers next week. So by the time you guys are hearing this on Shabbat or Sunday, we'll be getting right at the time where we're hosting people, inviting people in, and getting off the ground with the summer trip. And harvest season just around the corner. The summer trip only lasts for about 3 weeks. And then we've got a 2-week break, and then the harvest begins. We'll begin bringing in the produce. And I was out in the vineyard just yesterday. I was taking some folks around to see, and the clusters are looking really amazing. They're plump and beautiful. Green still, haven't started changing to purple yet. But the vineyards are looking beautiful, and it looks like it's going to be a very amazing, bountiful harvest season. So if you haven't got your application in to come for the harvest season, I would strongly encourage you. There is no other experience like coming and literally feeling the tangible reality of prophecy being fulfilled on the mountains of Samaria. To read your Bible and then see it happening right before your eyes, not only seeing it happening, but actually actively participating in it. There's just nothing like it. And so I'd strongly encourage you, come experience it here on the mountains of Israel. So this week's Torah portion is Chukat, which means decree. And we're in Numbers chapter 19, verse 1 through chapter 22, verse 1. And we start off the Torah portion with a very, very interesting subject and thing here of the Red Heifer. Now there's so many different things. I've heard so many different teachings about the Red Heifer and different things that it could symbolize, and it really is a pretty interesting thing. Why does it have to be red? And is there any connection between this red heifer and some sort of restitution or redemption process from the golden calf? Is there some sort of connection? And so there's so many different places you could go with this. I was really encouraged by a teaching I heard from Rabbi David Foreman with Aleph Beta. They have a website, alephbeta.com, maybe it's .org, but I would really encourage you to go there and see their videos. It's a rabbi that always has really, really good insights, and he's really great at tying Hebrew words to other Hebrew words that are used in the Bible, and there's always usually a really awesome connection. And that's what he did in his podcast. They actually have a podcast that they just started that he was talking about how, excuse me, about the connection between the Hebrew words for blood and red and earth. And it was really pretty fascinating because the Hebrew word for red that's used here is adumah. The Hebrew word for earth or dirt or land is adamah. And so from what I understand, it's just from Rabbi David Foreman was saying, there's only vowels that change the word from red to earth. So it's a very, very similar Hebrew word. And then the word for blood is dam. So you have adama, aduma, and then you have dam, which is blood. And you can kind of understand the connection between them all. Obviously, blood is red. The earth, has a red tinge, and then obviously the color red. So they're all very connected. He was connecting this story. He said, where do we, what other biblical narrative do we find red, blood, and earth in? And he tied it all back into the story of Cain and Abel. And we're very familiar with that story. It's like this blood crying out to me from the ground, right? And there's this ground and blood connection. And basically throughout the podcast, he shared about how he felt like one of the reasons for the whole procedure of this red heifer and taking ashes and cleansing someone who has come in contact with death is so that people don't become desensitized to death. That that God has put us here in this world for a purpose, to accomplish things, and that sometimes if we are maybe on a battlefield or in situations, or even just in however we come in contact with a dead person, somebody who has passed away, that maybe there's a certain level of desensitizing that happens. And so this process of the red heifer, taking the ashes, becoming purified and cleansed, this very ritual cleansing process that would help you kind of balance that out, that you would be able to become resensitized, right, to death, that life is what we're shooting for, that we're working towards a time where there'll be no more pain, be no more death, right? And so we don't want to become too accustomed or too desensitized to death happening here in this world, because we're shooting for it, we're working towards a time where there will be no more death. Back to the way it was in the Garden of Eden. And so he pointed out, and again, I would really encourage you to go and listen to it, because I was very encouraged by it, and he gave a lot more details into the words and things. But he talked about how this was the reason for the process of the red heifer, and he also talked about how we need to be really careful, especially in today's world with movies and video games and these things, that we don't become desensitized to death through these different things. You get on a video game and you shoot something or kill somebody or do these things, and people do these all the time. They get even play against each other and try to kill each other, and there's this language going on. Some of the video games out today that thankfully I haven't been too, I'm not too familiar with, but from what I understand, they're very, gory, very graphic, very, very depict death in a very vivid way, and so. The Rabbi David Foreman was pointing out that this is something we should be really careful about, that we don't become desensitized to death, and that we have an emphasis on life and bringing life into the world and all these things. So I thought it was really powerful, and just wanted to share that thought on the red heifer, and also wanted to tie that in because later on we have the story of the fiery serpents, right? These fiery snakes that come into the children of Israel, into the camp, and they're biting people and people are dying. And I always just thought, this is really weird. Like, what's going on with these snakes? It just, is a very strange deal. We had never had something like this happen before when the children of Israel complained, or whenever there was a problem that happened in the children of Israel. Fiery snakes, that's just a really, on face value, a very bizarre way to punish the children of Israel. Now, before there was a plague, there was fire came down from heaven or whatever, these different things. That kind of makes sense to us maybe. But what's the deal with these fiery serpents? And so obviously taking actually playing kind of a Rabbi Foreman kind of game here, like where did we hear about these kind of things before? And obviously snakes, we immediately tie back to Satan and the Garden of Eden, right? But then there's some questions here, because it's like, wait a second, why would Moshe build Satan onto a pole and put it up for everybody to look at? Like, that's kind of weird too. So I was just thinking about this and trying to break it down a little bit. What's really going on here? And maybe we can understand it better if we go back and look at what happened in the Garden of Eden. So we all know the story. Adam and Eve are in the garden. They're in heaven, basically, right? Heaven on earth. They're walking with God. Everything's perfect. And all of a sudden, this serpent comes and tells Eve, hey, did God tell you not to eat from the trees of the garden? And then Eve's like, well, actually, there's just the one tree we're not to eat from. And she says, we're not supposed to touch it. We're not supposed to eat from it. And then the serpent says, well, you're not going to die. And then so she sees that, oh, this looks pretty like there's good fruit there. And if it's to make somebody be wise, become smarter and know good and evil, hey, this all sounds good. So let's go for it. So she goes in, she eats the fruit, shares it with Adam, and then basically we have the fall of man, right? They disobeyed. They did not follow God's instruction. and they are kicked out of the garden. All right, so if we break this down a little bit more, why was Eve compelled to take of this fruit, and what happened in that situation? And we see here that Eve, all of a sudden, in the circumstance, became unsatisfied with everything that she had in the garden. She had to eat of that tree because she thought there was something more, right? She thought, if I eat this, then I will become wise. I'll become like God, right? That's what Satan's telling her. You become like God. And so she's like, it's worth it. At that moment, it was worth it for her to eat, to disobey God in order to take on something more. She's in the Garden of Eden, right? She is experiencing the most, unreal, ethereal scene ever, that she's been able to walk with God in the garden. She has everything, right? Except for this one tree, this fruit in this tree. But she's willing to risk everything to just taste this. So we have this idea here that she basically wasn't satisfied with what God had for her, and she reached out for more, which ended up banishing her from everything, right? So we see with the children of Israel here that they weren't satisfied with what God had for them, right? We see that they were becoming. What does it say? That in my translation here, it says that their spirit became short. I think it's the way it translates it. That they were getting tired, right? They had to go all the way around the country of Edom, and make a different path, and they were getting really tired. And then all of a sudden they say, "Oh, Moshe, why did you bring us out here? We don't have water, we don't have food, and this unsubstantial food." Here they got food falling out of heaven for them every day. They don't have to work for it. They don't have to grow it. They don't have to do anything. They just walk out and grab it, pick it up, bring it back in, and eat it. So we have a very similar situation here of children of Israel not being satisfied with what God had given them. Just like Eve, she had everything. She had miraculous, the most incredible life ever in the Garden of Eden, but she became unsatisfied with that. Same with the children of Israel. They had miraculous provision. We read later that their sandals weren't wearing out, their clothes weren't wearing out. They were living in just supernatural, miraculous things going on in their lives, but they became dissatisfied with that and started complaining. So I want to kind of dig into this a little bit more. Because, so here's a question. Why did, again, go back to the question of the serpent on the pole, like why did Moshe put up this snake on the pole, right? What's going on here? And even later in 2 Kings chapter 18, we find that this snake turns up again, this bronze serpent that Moshe had made. King Hezekiah has to go in and destroy it. So it's still a problem even later. And so my thought is along this same kind of line of thinking is that the reason why this serpent was held up is so that the people of Israel would see the serpent, right? If they hadn't gotten the idea that they were being ungrateful and the connection back to Eve from the beginning of the snakes biting them, then when they looked upon this bronze serpent, this snake, they would go, "Oh yeah, the snake, the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Yes, that's right. We have become ungrateful with what God has given us, and we're complaining when God is giving us everything that we need." So that kind of demystified a little bit to me. I know there's other commentators that also say that by looking up, they're looking up to God, the snake on the pole. But it also made sense to me that this could be another way to look at it, that they needed to acknowledge that they were being ungrateful for what they had. And in a way, yes, they are looking back to God because they're looking at the snake, recognizing that they were taking on the narrative of the snake, right? That it wasn't worth it to keep God's rules and to follow His way, but that they could go ahead and eat from the tree. And essentially there's this food connection here too, right? The food from the tree and then the manna. So that was my thought on that they're looking up to this serpent on the pole that Moshe put there, and they're recognizing, hey, we've also been deceived into believing that what God's given us is not enough, that we're dissatisfied with everything that He has given to us. Moshe's basically saying, here's the snake, you know who this is, what this looks like, how deception works, and recognize that in your life before you're removed from God's garden, right, from His protection, right, because the snakes are coming in and biting them and killing people. So this really got me thinking, okay, so if this is the whole lesson here, if this is the deal, if this is a lesson, a deal from this whole story, then we can really apply that in a lot of different ways in today's world, because we have laid out in Scripture God's way of living in this world, right? We have and I've talked about this before in podcasts, but we have this format that God has laid out there of family, right? We have grandparents who are being elders, instructing their children. We have parents who are raising the next generation, also instructing them. We have children who are obeying and showing honor to their parents, and how each one of these places is a training ground, and how God grows us in different ways through this format, this structure that He's put together. So all of a sudden, let's use that format as kind of a picture of the Garden of Eden, right? If a picture of the way God intended for things to be. If all of a sudden we become dissatisfied with the way that God is intended, and we go looking for something different, if Satan says, "Hey, well, you know what? Marriage isn't that big a deal. Just what's the use? Just that person over there may be better or maybe different, or and this isn't working anymore. It's getting rough, right? We're having to, we're getting tired, making our way all the way around Edom, or whatever place may be a little bit tiring on the journey. So hey, let's just scrap it. Let's go try something different." Even having children, right? There's a huge battle in today's world, and the abortion that's happening. It's crazy attack against children, against God's plan for how families should be structured. And this could apply to so many different places. Being accountable to one another. God's format, His plan. When we try to deviate from that, then all of a sudden we move ourselves out from God's protection. Right? We're removing ourselves from the Garden of Eden. So we need to learn how to be satisfied with what God is giving us. And I guess maybe that's the next question, right? Is okay, so if we've determined that the lesson in the Garden of Eden and the lesson here with these fiery serpents is that we need to be satisfied, then how do we become dissatisfied, right? How in the world could Eve in the Garden of Eden become dissatisfied with the Garden of Eden? Like that's crazy. How in the world could that happen? And as I was thinking about this and studying about it, I realized, what? We become dissatisfied with what God's giving us, what God has given us, by not choosing to think and talk about God, who He is, what He says, what He's done, and by not dwelling on who God is and thinking about it, and not intentionally reminding ourselves about these things, we naturally go to our current circumstance, right? We just go to whatever comes up next, and that circumstance, our human nature is to just follow that feeling, right? Whatever you wake up in the morning, like, oh, I have to go do this, I have to work on this, and we don't immediately think, if we're not careful, we don't immediately think, oh, I'm serving God today. God has given me so many blessings. I have a family. I have a wife and children. I have a beautiful home. All these different things that God has blessed me with, and start counting our blessings. So I think that is the place. If Eve had just paused for a second when the serpent came and told her, hey, you could have all this wisdom or whatever, be like God. If Eve had just paused for a second and thought, wait a minute, what has God already given me? What do I have to be thankful for? Maybe she wouldn't have been dissatisfied with that and gone on. Maybe she would have, and this was the fall of mankind, just this sin that happened. And it reminds me of Deuteronomy chapter 6, right? In verse 4, we have the Shema, right? Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be in your heart, right? Your heart's pumping. It's in your heart. It's exuding throughout your body all the time, at every moment. You shall teach them diligently to your children. Talk of them, right? Talk about it when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. Put them as frontlets between your eyes. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Basically, he's saying, take these things and put them everywhere so that you're thinking about it. You're looking at it. It's always in front of you. And I think that's really the lesson that we're getting here, is that in order not to become complacent, right? In order not to become dissatisfied with what God has given you, you need to think about it. You need to remind yourself who you are, where you're at. Because we tend to really just lock ourselves into that immediate circumstance, that thing that comes up right there. I heard a really funny story kind of along the same line. Rabbi Yehuda Glick, a Knesset member, was telling this story about this guy who was on an airplane, and he goes through the whole process, getting on the plane. He sits down, and they get up so many thousand feet up in the sky or whatever, and they say, the Wi-Fi should work now, whatever. So he gets on his phone, he starts, popping in the codes and all. And all of a sudden, it's just so slow. He can't do what he wants to do to get on and check things or whatever. The Wi-Fi is not working, and he just starts having a fit. He's like, oh my goodness, this Wi-Fi is just not working. And he was just so down and out about it. And Yehuda Glick's just in there looking at him like, guy, you're flying through the air on an airplane. What are you complaining about? The Wi-Fi doesn't work. And of course, the way Yehuda Glick said it was just hilarious. But it really goes to show you, he was in that circumstance where the Wi-Fi wasn't working, and all of a sudden he's just like, what is life even worth? Because the Wi-Fi didn't work when he's flying through the air in an airplane. Such a picture of how we can get into the moment and not realize the big picture of all the blessings that we're receiving even in that moment, right? It's so easy for us to acknowledge the negative, right? The seemingly negative things that are happening. Obviously, everything that God does is for the good. But again, whenever we have that temptation to be dissatisfied with where we're at, whenever we have that temptation not to be okay with whatever situation God has given us, we need to stop for just a second and think, okay, why am I here? What's going on? What has God blessed me with? And there's always so much to be thankful for. And so we need to be intentional, super intentional about our thoughts, about our actions, about our choices, right? Choices. We make decisions based on that spur of the moment deal. We react to things, and then we end up messing up, right? We end up doing things we wish we hadn't done. But if we can check ourselves, right? Pause for a second and do it. But I think, this whole idea of getting in that moment and just making a decision based off of that moment, I think, a lot of times we get in that moment and we just sort of check out, right? And we do the exact opposite of being intentional and pressing into believing or reminding ourselves of God's blessing. We sort of check out. I think the American culture is the worst at that. And it reminds me of a song. My dad, he used to listen to Keith Green and Randy Stonehill. And Randy Stonehill has this song called The Great American Cure. And it's like, put your brain in neutral and turn off the television set, or turn on the television set. And he's got this whole story about how, they haven't cut the power off yet or something like that. And, I went to the doctor all nervous and crazy, and I told him the way things were. So you got to go check out this song. But basically it's talking about how the American cure for everything is just check out. If you're feeling down and out, turn on the TV, crank up the music, go play some sports, pick up even a book, some book, or play a video game to just check out. There's a really interesting thing that my parents just got called media on the brain. I'd encourage you to look that up. That talks about the dangers of this thing of checking out, right? And so I think we need to be really intentional that when we get in that moment where we feel like checking out, we don't check out. We be intentional about pressing forward and overcoming that temptation and counting our blessings, pressing into acknowledging what God has done for us. Let's be like Israel, right? And they say that this Torah portion starting out, it was about 40 years after the last portion ended. We have Israel getting ready to go into the land, and we see that they were able to overcome. They conquered Sichon and Og, right? So let's be like Israel. Let's recognize our need to choose and acknowledge God's blessing and His work in our lives, and then go out to defeat our enemies and spiritually be ready to enter into the promised land. Thank you guys so much for listening. Shabbat Shalom from the beautiful, exceedingly good land of Israel.